Today we continue our study through Genesis. Last time we looked at the story of Joseph being sold into slavery by his jealous brothers. But now we were going to switch tracks and look at the children that Jacob had with both Leah and Rachel. We see at the start of this section that Rachel, Jacob's first wife, isn't bearing him any children, and so she becomes bitter towards her sister Leah. But then we see that Rachel does something very uncharacteristic of her. Until this point, Rachel has been this beautiful, gracious, kind woman. But here we see her become jealous, and she complains to her husband Jacob, "Give me children, or I will die." Wow, this sounds very selfish and ungrateful. Think about how many blessings Rachel has been given, yet she still isn't satisfied. She has wealth, status, power, and a loving husband. However, what she really wants are children, specifically a son. And this verse tells us why. "Am I in God's place?" Jacob replies that he has kept you from having children, to which Rachel responds, "Here is Bilhah, my servant. Go ahead and sleep with her so that she can bear children for me, and I too can build a family through her." So essentially what she's saying here is, okay, if I can't have kids, then let's just get someone else pregnant and I can just raise them as my own. Now, this is actually pretty common in those days. It was very important for a woman to have children, because the more children a woman had, the greater her value was in society. If she couldn't have children, then she would turn to one of her servants to have children on her behalf. And so Jacob sleeps with Bilhah and she bears him a son. And you can probably already guess what Rachel did. Of course, she took the child in and raised him as her own, because she had Bilhah, her servant, bear him a child. She thought that this was God vindicating her and listening to her plea, so she named him Dan. Now Bilhah, Rachel's maid, got pregnant again and gave birth to Jacob's second son. And once again, Rachel takes him in and raises him as her own. And so she names this child Naphtali, which means my struggle, or I have wrestled with my sister. And we know that she's referring to Leah, her sister, as she has had a great struggle with her sister, and she feels like she has finally won. Now Leah, on the other hand, hadn't had any children in 6 years, and so she does the same thing that Rachel had done earlier in the passage. She goes to her husband Jacob and says, "Give me children, or I will die." And so Jacob becomes very upset with both of these women because they were both acting so selfishly and only thinking about themselves and their own needs. And so he goes to God and asks for children. And God gives them to him. Leah's servant, whose name is Zilpah, conceived and gave birth to Jacob's 7th son. Then Leah said, "How good fortune," so she named him Gad. Zilpah, Leah's maid, bore Jacob a second son, and Leah said, "How happy I am. The women will call me happy," so she named him Asher. After this, Reuben, Jacob's oldest son, went out into the fields and found some mandrake plants. So he brought them back to his mother Leah. Now, if you've ever seen a mandrake root, you might think that it looks a bit obscene. And this plant was actually so popular amongst women that there were even laws passed against women picking these roots because they used them for fertility magic. Now, the verse doesn't explicitly say this, but it seems that Rachel wanted these mandrakes because she wanted to use them to make herself more fertile. And so she says to Leah, "Please give me some of your son's mandrakes." But Leah says, "Wasn't it enough that you took away my husband? Will you take my son's mandrakes too?" So this shows us that Leah has come to resent her sister Rachel as well. And this is a very interesting situation because they should want the same things, but their different personalities cause them to be at odds with each other. Rachel longs for a son and will do whatever it takes to get one, while Leah is content with the fact that she has a husband and therefore focuses on trying to have as many children as possible. And so Rachel says, "Very well, he can sleep with you tonight in return for your son's mandrakes."
Yeah.
So when Jacob comes in from the fields that evening, Leah goes out to meet him and says, "You must sleep with me." And so that night they have sexual relations, and Leah becomes pregnant and bears Jacob his 5th son. Then Leah said, "God has rewarded me for giving my servant to my husband." And so she named him Issachar. Then Leah conceived again and bore Jacob a 6th son. Then Leah said, "God has presented me with a precious gift. It's time my husband will treat me with honor, because I have borne him 6 sons. So she named him Zebulon. Then she gave birth to a daughter and named her Dinah. And we see here that Leah is very thankful for her 6 sons and decides to name her daughter Dinah, which means she is judged. At this point in the story, Rachel had been barren for 14 years, and you can imagine how disheartened and dejected she must have felt. But now we see that God remembers Rachel and turns his attention back to her. And this is such a powerful picture of God's mercy and faithfulness. Despite Rachel's flaws, God has unforgotten about her, and he turns his attention back to her and enables her to conceive. She becomes pregnant and gives birth to a son and says, "God has taken away my disgrace." And so she names him Joseph. We see here that Rachel is thankful to God that he finally gave her a son, and she even prays that God will give her another, and he does. Shortly after, she gives birth to Jacob's 12th and final son, Benjamin. It appears that Laban didn't like the fact that Jacob wanted to leave him and go back home, so he tries to keep Jacob there as long as possible. And this is shown in this passage where Laban says to Jacob, "If I have found favor in your eyes, please stay. I have learned by divination that the Lord has blessed me because of you." And Laban tried to bribe Jacob with material possessions to stay there longer. But Jacob refuses and says, "No, I want to go back home." And so Laban and Jacob make an agreement about the terms of Jacob's departure. And this agreement is that Jacob can take all the animals that have markings on them, such as stripes or spots, as his wages. And Laban agrees to this deal because he knew that most of the healthy animals wouldn't be chosen. But Jacob, on the other hand, knew that the weaker animals would go to Laban, but the stronger females would come to him. And so Jacob was able to deceive Laban and steal the best animals and end up leaving 7 times the amount of livestock that he arrived with. And so Jacob sets up these branches in the troughs so that when the animals come to drink, they would mate with the striped branches. And the next day, when the animals were in heat, they mated with the branches. I know. This caused the next generation of animals to have markings on them. And Jacob was able to collect the young animals and raise them separately and not mix them with Laban's animals. Now this may seem quite silly, but there's a deeper meaning behind Jacob's actions. This was Jacob's way of blessing his children and grandchildren, because every time one of these marked animals was born, it reminded the people that Jacob had been here. And this also gave Jacob a way of identifying which animals were his and which ones belonged to Laban. And this brings us to the end of this section, where we see that Jacob ends up with huge flocks of animals, lots of servants, and ultimately became very rich. So what are the main lessons that we can learn from this passage? Firstly, this passage shows us the importance of being thankful for what we have. Both Rachel and Leah were extremely ungrateful women, because despite all the blessings that God had given them, they weren't satisfied and instead chose to focus on their negative circumstances. Secondly, we see here that God is just and righteous. He will never force children on someone. If they don't want children, he won't force them to have them. For example, when Rachel tells Jacob, "Give me children or I'll die," Jacob rightly responds by saying, "Am I in the place of God who has kept you from having children?" And thirdly, this passage reminds us that we should thank God for our fathers. I know that some of you guys might not have had the best relationship with your dad, but we should still thank God for our dads, because without them we wouldn't be here. Think about it. If your mom and dad didn't have a romantic relationship, then you wouldn't exist. And so we should thank God for our fathers, who showed our mothers love and pursued them romantically, and this resulted in us being born. So thank you for joining me. I hope that you enjoyed this episode. If you did, feel free to leave a like. If you want to watch more, click on the subscribe button so that you don't miss out on any new videos. See you soon.